Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. Heaven is Void of Light, written by Magic Rectangle. Amy Tannis and her husband, Jonathan, were working late into the night. Their laboratory was buried almost a kilometer beneath Ida Basin, the largest ice sea of Ganymede. It was in a geologically stable area and far from any population centers, but it was a pain of a commute, so they often slept in the lab, woke up, and went right back to work. They had all the funding and the autonomy that they could ever want. They worked 12 to 18-hour days, not because they had to, but because they were close, so close, to something that would change humanity's place in the universe forever. They'd run hundreds of trials already. Opening the breach wasn't the problem. Feed too much power into the engine, and the breach would go wild. Too little, and it would almost instantly collapse in on itself. If they were going to figure out what was on the other side, they needed a stable breach. Jonathan had had the foresight to insist the breach chamber be 500 meters from any of the control systems, which had probably saved their lives the first time an unstable breach ate away the breach engine, and much of the test chamber and surrounding rock. Rebuilding after such an event was time-consuming, so the research mostly focused on gathering more and more data from the tiny underpowered breaches in the moment it took them to collapse. There was only so much that could be learned from this timid approach, though. It couldn't just be about power. They'd already identified the critical point between an unstable breach and a collapsing one. They had plenty of information about the collapsing breaches themselves, too. They needed more data from the unstable ones to understand what was going on. She'd argue with Jonathan many times about it. They'd plateaued. She knew it, he knew it, but he still thought it was too risky to intentionally open an unstable breach. To assuage his fears, she redesigned the Squelch, the system that could clamp shut an errant hole in the universe. She'd made backup systems for backup systems for backup systems, hoping to put his mind at ease. Ultimately, though, she knew what really scared him, the fact that she wasn't scared. The moment she'd seen the first unstable breach, her own eyes, something had changed in her. It was subtle, but she knew it was there. She wanted to see it again. She needed to. Jonathan had the opposite reaction. He'd sealed the viewing window and insisted they only watch the experiment through the closed-circuit monitoring system. This time, though, she'd come up with something that he couldn't argue his way around. A way that the breach engine could project the breach to a remote location. They wouldn't need to have any difficulty to replace equipment in the test chamber, just the sensors. They could even move the test chamber several kilometers away if they wanted to. Kian Byron's father had been an ice miner. When his uncle Shane suffered a hypoxic brain injury from a faulty atmospheric unit in his drill rig, Kian's father began agitating to form a union. He should have known better. Some big shop corporate fecks on Earth weren't going to sit around and let an uppity miners cut into their profits. First, there was the accident. The oxygen tank on his rig sprung a leak due to metal fatigue. The backup oxygen was missing from his emergency kit, despite him checking it first thing at the start of his shift, like always. He told Kian that he only lived because his tank failed earlier than it was meant to. There was still enough oxygen in the cab for him to make it back. His father got paranoid after that, but the stubborn son of a witch didn't back off. If anything, he pushed harder to try and get the union going. 2 weeks after the accident, Kian's father simply vanished. The bootlickers at Security Op moved to Callisto and shacked up with some whore. Now Kian knew his father was no saint, but he hadn't even taken his toothbrush or change of clothes. He might not know the details, but it wasn't a fecking mystery what had happened, or who was responsible. It was the same all over Ganymede. As far as Earth Alliance was concerned, the moon was a labor and resource for them to exploit as they saw fit, and anybody who got in the way of that didn't last long. So when a friend introduced him to some guys in Ganymede Independence Front, he signed up for the spot. As militias went, they were pretty organized. He climbed the ranks to lieutenant and had been given command of his own squad. And today, it would all pay off. Today, the bastards were going to get theirs. Kian heard his name, rousing his thoughts back to the present. His unit commander stood in front of the room, going over the plan. They would attack several government facilities across the moon simultaneously. Lieutenant Byron will take the 3rd Squad to assault the EA research facility under the Ida Basin. It is only accessible by a single tram and elevator system. They will hijack the tram, take out any security present, and claim the facility for the GIF. Recon details are in your briefing packet. Not exactly a glamorous assignment. Not when many of his compatriots would be assaulting proper government installations, or taking control of shipping systems that bled the lifeblood out of Ganymede back to Earth. Still, it must be important. The EA liked to use Ganymede for military research and testing. It was likely that they were developing weapons there. Nothing that they could immediately use, most likely. But it was a good bet that whatever it was would be bad for the meters down the line. Kian and his squad went over the equipment before it was time to hurry up and wait. Jonathan Tallis listened patiently as his wife explained her latest innovation. She was brilliant. If he was honest, she was smarter than he was. But where she was creative, he was methodical. It was why they made a good team. They could bring her back to reality, or at least make sure her ideas were implemented in safe and thoughtful ways. Remote opening of the breach, though, it was clear that she'd thought of it as a way to allay his safety concerns, but it scared him for an entirely different reason. Their research was technically funded by the military. That had always bothered him a little. Amy was happy to have funding, with little regard for who paid or why. But now, if she really could open breaches kilometers away from the breach engine, possibly many thousands of kilometers even, the possibility of weaponizing their research moved from abstract to very real. Images of ships, armies, cities, planets all vanished into a black abyss beyond the breaches flashed through his mind. Oblivious to his distress, his wife excitedly made her case. She'd already modified the breach engine. It had apparently been quite simple once she realized the governing principle. Worrying over the technical details would at least distract him from thinking about the broader implications of the technology for a while. So he was carefully reviewed her notes and schematics. Let's test it now. We don't need a new test chamber yet. We can just open it a few meters off center from the breach engine to verify that it works. If it fails, it'll just open normally, no big deal. She was practically vibrating with excitement, not giving him time to process everything. We need to run simulations first. The knot in his stomach kept getting tighter as he stalled. You really think that I modified the breach engine without doing simulations? Page 22. She reached over his shoulder, flipping the pages herself, too excited to wait for him to do it. Sweetheart, you know I have to go over all of this myself before we do anything. We won't be testing it for weeks. I can't believe you modified the breach engine before you even showed me any of this. Amy made a party face at him, but she wouldn't push it further. She knew how important due diligence was. She was just excited. John sat down and began to study her notes in more detail. All right, I need to learn all of this. If she understood his implied request to be left alone, she ignored it, hovering behind him. Go away, you maniac. This will probably take me as long to understand as it took you to dream up. Leave me in peace. Shoo! Amy wasn't sure what woke her. She'd slept in her clothes, on the couch in her office again, but something felt off this morning. She walked down the hall towards the facility's only entrance, a large freight elevator. The graveyard shift security detail, two soldiers whose names she'd never bothered to learn, were not standing in their usual casual manner. They had their rifles raised, pointing them at the elevator door. What's going on? The soldier closest to her kept his focus on the elevator and as he replied, The tram was activated using a duress code. It was a security feature. If you were forced to enter your code, you added an extra sequence that alerted the facility's security. The tram and elevator would still work, but whoever was in it would have the nasty surprise waiting for them. Amy decided the thing to do was to wake Jonathan and let the soldiers do their job. She'd only gotten halfway to his office when she heard a bang, followed quickly by several gunshots. She broke into a run. Jonathan was still asleep. He could sleep through anything. She shook him. We're in trouble. Get up. We need to hide. What? The lady said that you need to hide. Sounds like good advice, but a bit late for that. Even before Amy turned to see him, the man's strong meat accent told her all she needed to know. You didn't hear that accent in military personnel. You definitely didn't hear it in academic circles. In fact, despite living on Ganymede for more than 3 years now, she could count on one hand how many people she'd met who spoke with it. Amy had a general idea that there was some unrest amongst the locals on Ganymede. In that moment, as she turned and saw the meter who had pointed their rifle at her, she wished that she'd learned a bit more about it. "You're the scientist. You sure as hell ain't military. I doubt the cleaning staff can get away with wearing sweatpants to work." Jonathan spoke up before she could. "My name is Dr. Jonathan Tillis. This is my wife, Amy." Why had he introduced her like that? He did think that minimizing her role in the research would improve her odds of surviving this. She highly doubted it, but she was willing to let him take the lead here. He watched the news and was interested in politics, so at least he might know what this was all about. "All right, Doctor." The man jabbed Amy in the side with the barrel of his gun. "I think your wife would appreciate it if you told me what research you were doing here." "I'm a physicist. I'm researching what's beyond our universe. Maybe someday it could lead to new technologies. But right now it's only an academic interest. There's nothing here that you could use as a weapon." The man clearly didn't like his answer. "If that were true, you wouldn't have soldiers at the door. This is a military facility. Treat me like an idiot again and you'll regret it." "It is true, I swear. The military expects to get something for their money, of course. I told them it had potential as a method of travel, possibly faster than light, but I played that up to get the funding. I honestly don't know if anything practical will come of it. Research is in a straight line. I don't know. I don't know. It seemed like Jonathan was hyperventilating at this point. His words poured out just a bit too fast. Amy wasn't so sure minimizing the project's importance was the right strategy. These people had come here looking for something, right? She didn't know what they expected to get out of this, but she was pretty confident that nothing was not it. The duress code had been used. There would be reinforcements arriving soon, most likely. They needed to stall for time. Wasn't it better to offer them something that they would want? To tell them that they'd found something that could shift the balance of power in their favor, but that they would need Amy and John to finish it for them. "Okay, Doc, then tell me, what is beyond our universe?" I don't know exactly." The man laughed. It was more cruel than jovial. He motioned for Amy and Jonathan to walk in front of him, guiding them to the offices towards the main entrance. "That's rich, Doc. How much do you think this facility of yours cost? How many meters stuck down here? Built this shit. EA steals our blood, sweat, and tears, gives them over to you, so you can learn absolutely fucking nothing. That's just great, Doc. Perfect." As they entered the main hall, they looked towards the elevator. Both soldiers' bodies had been left where they fell. The elevator door was closed, but bloody boot prints leading away suggested that something bad had happened inside. "Jacob, William, what have you done? These men had families. I met Jacob's son. He's only 4 years old." Jonathan sounded practically manic. Amy couldn't remember meeting any soldiers' sons. When had that happened? Certainly not here. The facility was restricted. The man leaning slightly and spit on Jacob's corpse. "I had family too. We all had families until you destroyed them. Don't expect sympathy from me." You people. That was not a good sign. He was lumping Amy and John in with the military, or maybe he hated everybody from Earth. Either way, it meant that they're most likely headed for the same fate as the guards. The man walked them into the control room, where 5 other militants were talking and laughing with each other. The control room was the largest area in the lab, save for the test chamber itself. Technically, monitoring the experiments was the room's primary role, but most of the time experiments weren't running. In practice, it was used for any work that was too cumbersome to do in the office. That meant that most of the specialized equipment used for the research was built there. Against the far wall were the computers and monitoring equipment used to run experiments. On the right wall, nearest the computers, was the old window, now shuttered. On the near wall, just right of the door, was a large screen, with a couch in front of it. Theoretically, it was for spectators, military brass, or politicians to watch the experiments. Most of the time, it was used for playing video games when they needed to decompress. The rest of the room had workbenches, tools, and projects in various stages of completion. As far as Amy could see, Nothing was out of place. Nobody else out here? There was no military discipline in this unit of fighters, but they did quiet down and listen to the man. He seemed to be in charge. That's fine, 2 prisoners is good at a number, especially when one of them is the lead scientist. He shoved Jonathan forward. So, Doc, you say the project is useless, but I'd like to decide that for myself. This is clearly where you run things from, so let's see it in action. How about it? You want to show me what's outside the universe? He let out a low chuckle. Now that sounded like a good idea to Amy. Apparently to John, too, as he took a seat at the main control computer and handed a tablet off to her. The man grabbed Amy by the arm. And what do you think you're doing then? This is a complicated piece of equipment. It wasn't designed to be controlled by just one person. My husband needs to monitor spatial integrity and dozens of other variables while I operate the breach engine itself. If you want to watch the experiment, it will be displayed over there. Amy gestured with the tablet towards the large screen by the door. Most of the militants seemed happy to gather in front of the screen, but the one in charge kept tight hold of Amy, still standing only a meter behind John. I can see fine from here. Getting them all in one place would be too much to hope for. Amy began programming the shot. They didn't have a lot of information about the unstable breach, and she needed a small one, not more than half the size of the room. She pegged the energy outburst just barely above the critical point. The man was watching John and her, not the screen. That was good. His back would be to the breach when it opened. The trouble was he still had a firm grip on her arm. He had at least 15 kilos on her, and he was in good shape. But she would have the element of surprise. She only needed a moment. There was a whoop-crack suck of rushing air as the breach sprung into existence. It swallowed the other 5 militants in an instant. A writhing hole in the world. A breach that was only 2 meters in front of her. Tendrils and cracks so dark that they seemed to swallow the nearby light. Shivered their way through the fabric of the universe. The breach almost looked alive, the way that it pulsed and twisted. As expected, the man was caught off guard. He looked over his shoulder to see what was happening. This was a moment. She lunged with all her strength. He stumbled backwards, but didn't let go. She could barely hear her husband calling her name over the pounding of her heartbeat. She couldn't stop, couldn't turn back to him. If she gave the man even a moment to regain his balance, he would overpower her. She kept pushing. I'm sorry, John. Amy and the man tumbled into the gaping black maw of the breach and were gone. Amy was disoriented. She couldn't see. She couldn't feel. She couldn't hear. But she could. Just not with ears, not with flesh. She was immersed in darkness, deeper than black between the stars. She became aware that she had no body, but still, she had senses. Different senses. Better senses. There was a sound. It was so quiet at first that she thought that it was her imagination. But as she focused on it, she found structure, melody. There were no words, no notes. It wasn't a music that any human could ever make, but it was beautiful. She let it carry her deeper, further into the dark. Her mind filled with visions, both horrible and wonderful, until she could no longer tell the difference. Nothing was out there. Everything was out there. She had conversations with herself on topics that no creature of the universe would ever consider. She bathed her mind in fire and blood, in transcendence. It was herself she was conversing with, wasn't it? Of course. Who else would it be? There's nobody here, of course, of course. Time stretched on in eternal moments. How long had she been here? How long had she been free? Days? Years? Centuries? She knew things that no human had ever known, could ever know. But most importantly, she knew that the universe was wrong. Here, now, this was what existence was meant to be. The universe is an aberration, a sin. A new melody found her mind. It was familiar. It was not the sound of this place. It was flawed. But it was John. She knew his voice. It could be no other. He'd come. Oh, the things she had to show him. But she needed to find him first. For minutes or years she tried to follow their song, but got no closer. Where was he? He had to be here. If she couldn't find him, maybe he could find her. She would sing back to him. She swelled in elation. as he responded, their songs mixed and growing louder together. She could sense herself growing closer to him. She thought that she could almost feel him. But she felt something else instead. Something wrong. Flesh, no. It was closing in on her. Her perception was shrinking. She stopped singing, but it was too late. Her vision shrunk, confined behind gelatinous orbs. Her hearing narrowed to vibrations in bone and sickly fluid. She felt through pressure and heat on skin. Desperately, she tried to cling to the piece of transcendence as a flesh prison took shape. She looked, now with only eyes, at a new form. A pale mockery of her true self. The closest that could exist under the twisted laws of the disgusting universe. She had legs, perhaps a dozen of them, and as many arms, eyes and mouths too, all down the length of her form. Her arms were jagged and black, almost blade-like. Her legs stabbed into the concrete floor, cutting pieces from it. Her torso wound several meters up to her head, where thousands of oversized cilia felt about her, gathering information in a pathetic approximation of true feeling. She found John's face. Recognition was there, but also horror and disgust. She understood perfectly. As disturbing as it must have been to see her reduced to flesh, his form was even worse. 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, pink skin without a trace of the sublime. She could see 1,000 questions fighting to find their way to the surface on the meat of his face. She knew what he wanted to ask, what he needed to know, and she would show him. She would save him. A deep, echoing, scratching sound escaped her mouths as she spoke the closest approximation to truth that could exist in this wretched universe. Heaven is void of light, John. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Parky, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakul, and Arcadian.